First, I want to thank everybody for being here. No, apparently not. All right. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank the Rocket City Tavern for hosting the event. I'd just like to start with a few acknowledgments before we get into the panel. I really appreciate all the speakers who have preceded me. Thrilled to hear Dr. Went's comments about political science and social science and the importance of those areas as part of the larger scientific strategy to technically understand UAP. I think as we go through the evolutions of understanding all of the nuanced dynamics of this very complex problem set, I think it's an imperative to also consider those soft sciences as part of the larger strategy, because this ultimately involves societal aspects and public policy matters that we just can't ignore. So I want to thank the speakers, all of you, for coming forward. It does take some courage to step forward and speak openly about the topic, and I just want to extend my thanks and appreciation to you all for the presentations that have come so far. Would love to thank the friends, and you know who you are in the audience, who, when asked, made the trip and traveled down here. There are some people that I specifically asked if they'd come, and they did, and I want to just let you all know how touched I am and how appreciative we all are that you did make the special trip. I'd like to thank the Hoffman family for their support to Rich, because Rich is a friend, and I know he couldn't do this without them. I'd also like to thank my wife and my kids and my nieces are out in the audience helping out. So just thank you all very much. Could not do it without my wife and my daughters and my beautiful nieces. So thank you all. And I'm going to get into the topic shortly. I'm going to do a brief introduction on our panel. The topic today, it's not really a presentation. It's more of a discussion and an exchange of thoughts. It's the national security implications of scientifically studying UAP. We're not really discussing the threat narrative. We're just discussing the implications to national security by pursuing this topic from a non-emotional, a scientific perspective. Before we get into that, I just want to introduce our panel members very quickly. You've all got their bios, but I just want to say a few words about each of them. Mr. Rich Hoffman, he's got almost 60 years in this area as an investigator and as a thought leader. He was part of Project Blue Book in an advisory role, and he brings a wealth of knowledge in spectrum management, spectrum analysis, technical investigations, and IT. And we're very fortunate to have him lead this event, and I'm very lucky and appreciative to have him on the panel. Next is a man who, in my mind, needs no introduction, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Dr. Garry Nolan, a friend, a professor in the Department of Pathology at Stanford. He's known for the Atacama study. Amongst many other notable initiatives and projects, he is another thought leader in the scientific study of this topic, and considered one of the preeminent subject matter experts in understanding the analytical process to examine metamaterials. Next is Dr. Josh Pierson. Josh is a 25-plus year strategic security professional. He is currently working on a doctoral dissertation specific to UAP. It's one of the first I've seen of its kind, and I think his work is going to be seminal to the topic. We're thrilled to have him, and I think it's going to be a little bit enlightening today when he gets into some of the discussions about his particular study. And then last is another friend and colleague, Dr. Matt Szydagis, professor at the State University of New York, one of the key people that the SCU looks to for topics related to dark matter, and was recently featured in the documentary A Tear in the Sky. I know Garry Voorhees is out here, so there he is. Hey, Garry. Garry and the team are out here with Dr. Travis Taylor and a few others, and it's an amazing piece of work. I encourage all of you to take a look at it, and please check it out. So if I did miss anybody, please forgive me. And with that, we're going to get into the discussion. So this is a panel conversation. I'm going to start with a question and lead into one of the subject matter experts here up in our panel, and they'll provide their thoughts, their perspective, and then the rest of the panel will be able to chime in with their own opinions. We'll go down the line, and at the end of the event, we'll take questions from the audience. So the first question, and this pertains, I think, really to everybody in the room. It should be of interest because it'll resonate with everybody. It should anyway. How would the scientific study of UAP potentially impact our intelligence collection platforms or strategies? And here's a nuance. By understanding the manner in which the scientific study done in organizations like the SCU, UAPX, and other technically oriented entities, when we can better inform our intelligence strategies from a technical collection perspective, there's always a cascading derivative of thought leadership and insight that trickles out into groups like UAPX and SCU, and vice versa in some cases. So this is a very thoughtful question that I'd like Josh to lead off in terms of providing some perspective. Again, it's how would the scientific study of UAP potentially impact our intelligence collection platforms or strategies? Dr. Pierson.
I think that starts with understanding the purpose of intelligence analysis and intelligence collection. The purpose of intelligence collection and analysis is to identify a threat, to understand capabilities and intent of an adversary. And so the cascading effect would then put policymakers in a position to where they have to render judgment. And the difference between doing intelligence analysis vice scientific method style of technical collection and analysis of data to determine varying hypotheses, when we're looking at the problem set from an intelligence perspective, at the end of the research, with whatever you have, the analyst makes a judgment. And then that judgment is what becomes what the policymaker makes a decision off of. So when we talk about why is it that the government or some other aspect may not be so forthright with certain parts of information, we really come down to two problems. One, we discussed briefly yesterday, derivative classification authority, which means that if you have a technical collection capability and you pull data off of that and you start cataloging it, everything that comes off of that because of the source or method is what makes it classified. The information may not necessarily be classified, but the methodology collecting it is what makes it classified. And so now the next step is once that is put into an intelligence report and then validated and verified through structured analytic techniques and analytical tradecraft, the analyst makes a judgment, and then that judgment goes forward to the policymaker. The decision that policymaker makes can have an effect that we don't necessarily understand. And so that's when we start getting into the gray zone and how it is we interact with our friends, our allies, and even our adversaries, is when we make that judgment, that now becomes a policy. And when that policy is in place, it's very hard to walk it back from that. And so if we scientifically analyze UAP through technical collection means, and then we run it through an analytical judgment or an analytical process, it's going to lead to a policymaker making a judgment that can have an effect that we don't foresee. So which could be why part of the reason why we're met with a lot of resistance when we're trying to interact with governments to extrapolate data from them for us just to do analysis to determine through the scientific method.
So, Rich, do you have any comments to add to that?
Yeah, I do. One of the challenges I see with the whole collection process, and I've experienced this in other types of situations. For example, and I know that UAPX will be glad to tell you that they took a lot of hours of data. The question is, how do you discern that data down to the point where you're actually looking and focusing on the one object or whatever that object is, and trying to now do something. And so there's always been a data collection problem in the sense that you may have hundreds of thousands of hours of video or data or something like that when it actually happened at one spot, you know, or in that specific time. And if you put that then in a larger context in terms of, let's say, an entire carrier group with all the data that they can get, how do you get all that data synthesized to be able to give you something that's meaningful? Because it takes hours to analyze the data. So unless you have something like maybe AI or machine learning or something to help you to do those types of things, it's like then giving that to an intelligence analyst who's now going to be working with that and deducing something from it. I see a lot of challenges with that. I work in the Army world, and we try to get data, you know, in one spot, and we're extremely difficult challenge. You have a general making decisions based upon information that's probably changed or old or various other things because it's not necessarily in real time. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think we've got a lot of work ahead with just the sheer volume of stuff, and I think that's already, you know, like Matt will be glad to tell you that he's creating algorithms to help him to go through and sort through the data to try to find specific things that he can share and have somebody now look at, right? So that's kind of like where I'm at with that whole data collection, but I think that, you know, obviously the process is once it does get into the intelligence world, that it is, like he's talking about, you take that to leaders and you help them to develop policies.
Dr. Nolan, any comments?
Well, obviously I'm more of an academic than most of the other people up here. You know, I look at it from the standpoint of what we do in the cancer research that we do, where we're getting enormous volumes of novel information that we need to sort out and put together. And so I wonder how much a problem it is that the information is getting siloed and not shared with enough people who can bring in novel hypotheses. Because once you come up with what you think is the way, it starts to become, it becomes the niche exploitation problem. Somebody has started and said, this is the way we do it, and then other ways are not considered. So how do you allow for advancement of the technologies that you're using to investigate the problem, and also the algorithms before things become set in stone? And so, because that's going to lead to interpretation problems if you limit yourself from the novel ways of thinking about it. And that's the reason why we're all here, right? We're all here because people have said, no, we're not going to even bother looking at this anymore.
Right. Dr. Szydagis, any comments?
Yes, so I'm in academia, and I agree with a great deal of what's been said, but especially by what Dr. Nolan just said, is you have to do a risk-benefit analysis, and I think a lot of damage is done by the classification system we have in the siloization, because then you don't have interdisciplinary outside-the-box thinking. And so then it's very, very hard to make progress. I have seen this also again and again in science where things aren't classified, but it just so happens that Group A didn't talk to Group B, and Group B didn't realize Group A had already solved the problem 30 years ago. But that's exacerbated when it's actually you have classification of information, and people who might have had the answer to certain aspects of the phenomenon 10, 20, 30 years ago are not allowed to see the data. So what I always have been trying to push for, it's one of the questions I asked last night, is why can't we just release all of the juiciest alleged images and videos and just scrub the parts that would reveal the classified technology, how the radar or the good cameras work? I've had absolutely no good answer to that question. It doesn't make any sense to me. You can scrub the sensitive information, just not say, oh, this was with the Spy 1 radar, or this was with this technology, but here's this juicy piece of information. It's better than nothing, and I think it'd be better, much better than what we have now.
I appreciate it, Matt. I think one of the key themes that comes out of this conversation is the need for collaboration and sharing of information across non-governmental organizations like the SCU and UAPX, which thankfully I think we're working on a collaborative effort with UAPX to share information and provide some synergies and enable those relationships in a productive way. Dr. Pierson, I was wondering if you'd use this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about your doctoral work, your dissertation, and speaking to some of your research.
So I took a different stance than, first, I'm not a physical scientist or an astrophysicist by trade. I am a strategic security professional. It's where my whole life has been. It's been my life's work, is really addressing the very issues that we're talking about here, is how do we work through the classified system to get out what needs to get out, and vice, what do we need to secure to make sure that we don't have our adversaries be aware of what it is that we have a capability for, right? So my dissertation focused on how would me as a strategic security professional look at this problem, and what would I do to inform a policymaker or other members of the intelligence and strategic security community of what they should look at when they're attempting to calibrate sensors, whatever the verbiage is that we're going with the issue today. And so my research question was, what are the measurable and detectable signatures that UAP present? So I started with 5 off of Lou Elizondo's show and said, this is going to be our starting point. And as I went through the research process, which starts with the intro, where you define your research questions, you start addressing your criteria, and then you address the lit review. At the literature review is when I realized that 5 wasn't going to be enough. And it increased to about 14. And these are, and I'm going to get to what denoted measurable and detectable. At the end of it, after completing Chapter 3 and working through Chapter 4, which Chapter 4 is not approved yet, so I'm still waiting on the committee to approve the research and to see if I need to go back and do more. So what I'm going to say may have to go back and be relooked. But at this point, I was able to analyze 100 cases within the time allotted, and what it grew to was 41 signatures, which are measurable and detectable. Now, measurable and detectable in the strategic security field has a different connotation than in the scientific field, because we put a lot of emphasis on the human sensor. And of the 100 reports that I reviewed, 99 originated from an eyewitness. 41 of those were validated by some sort of technical collection aspect. Only one collection was initiated by a radar. Now, that's telling for me as a strategic security professional that although eyewitnesses can tend to exaggerate thought processes or comments, or maybe the data may not necessarily be trustworthy, it gives us a starting point to start to look at other means of detecting what the phenomena is and addressing it through a different aspect. And if we're able to use human sensors to identify areas where there could be clusters or saturation, then we can use a multimodal, mobile and deployable collection platform, much like what UAPX created, to dispatch and then collect on that area to either confirm or deny what it is that's actually being reported. So that was probably the most interesting finding in my study, was the role of the human sensor that we so often discount. The other aspect of that is of those, the methodology behind assessing human sensor is I needed at least 2 sources. So at least 2 individuals had to see or observe the phenomena and render a report that had some close characteristics. And again, some of these are very old. I went from 1940s all the way through to the 2000s. And so there are some gaps in that. And then what I did is I took it through a curation standard of, is this something that the national security community would be concerned about? And then worked it through there to get to roughly of those 100 cases, 60% came back with an established standard of trustworthiness, of credibility. And it's something that we can use as a guideline within the strategic security community to inform the scientific community to go, hey, check this area out. Because you all have the capability to understand the measurement and signatures aspects of the phenomena, which is not necessarily something that is within my wheelhouse, but is definitely something that we can inform to cue where we should look at.
Josh, thanks for your comments and sharing. Rich,
Can
do you have anything
yeah,
to add?
I'd like to make a comment, and that is that, and of course, I lived in the world of anecdotal records because, you know, when you were dealing with without computers and technology back in 1964, 65, 66, it was all anecdotal, you know, and you'd have occasional crude drawings that people would make, and I've been out with 30 witnesses, and all 30 drew different kinds of things that they saw, right? So that's a challenge in this whole context of trying to get an understanding when you're getting the anecdotal brought in. And I'll also point out that, you know, when we dealt with the Aguadilla video, for example, you know, that was a situation where we primarily focused on the video, although the witnesses did, you know, give us some information, you know, that we were able to go with, but you're dealing with just that one segment of data, you know, if you would, the video, and you tried to understand that. And that's where it's often a challenge. And let me also point out to you that I think I told you before that we're installing at all the DoD locations these detection systems to allow us to see what's going on above our ranges and our perimeters. And in that context, this is a perfect opportunity if you think about wanting to collect intelligence about objects that the government's telling you that are coming on their ranges, right? That here's where the disconnect is. We're putting these systems out, spending millions of dollars to do that, just for the local people to be able to have the force protection people to run out and fix things. That ought to be going into the fact that if these are UAP, they ought to be going into that collection system you're talking about, so you're now benefiting from the data and the information you've got out there to do that, right? So we've got to get together the intelligence piece of this, working with the fact that we're constantly fielding these kinds of systems and making sure that it is supplying the information that we want.
Thanks, Rich. I appreciate that. Clearly, there's a need for greater collaboration between private groups like the SCU and the government. It's just a matter of finding the right mechanisms and venues to enable that type of synergy. On a separate but sort of related note to Dr. Pierson's dissertation, thankfully we've got Dr. Davis is on his committee and has been a critical part of enabling the level of quality coming through his research. So, Eric, thanks for all your support to Josh. Josh, if you don't mind, I'd like to just loop back to you for a moment. Would you be able to talk about any one particular case out of your study that stood out the most in terms of the variety of signatures you were able to document and catalog, just to give the audience an understanding of the depth you took to look at the human sensor as in essence, a collection platform?
So there's two, well, really three. The 1953, I believe, the 1953 Haneda case with the Navy aircraft that had multiple phenomena interacting, so what I like to say, interacting with the aircraft. And then the 2004 Nimitz case, of course, and of course the 2014 and 15 Theodore Roosevelt case. All of them have had common signatures and common reporting across credible eyewitnesses and through the data collection capability, or the technical collection capability that was present on those aircraft, all indicated common signatures. So like we know that because we live it in the UAP enterprise, in the UAP world, like in the community. We understand that. But to be able to put that into a dissertation, when to my knowledge, the last dissertation published from a physical science perspective on UAP was 1969. After that, it was all psychology, parapsychology, social aspects of believing in UAP like it became its own religion. And so this dissertation is now giving voice to what Gary Voorhees experienced, what what Ryan experienced, what all these individuals experienced, say, look, like this not only occurred here, but in 1953, and I might have the date wrong, and I apologize for that, we have an aircraft that actually both technically collected and had eyewitnesses reporting was indicating using Morse code to communicate. At the same time, while following the aircraft, doing other interactive means with it, forcing it to do evasive maneuvers, which is a lot of the same signatures we saw with the 2004 case and with the 2014 and 15 case. So this isn't necessarily an issue that doesn't have longevity, nor that has. So we can't ignore the longevity of the issue, and we can't ignore the transience of it. That it has happened in 3 distinctly different areas and environments where this has occurred, and they have common signatures. And I can break some of those down if you'd like.
Yeah, please.
So the color of the object was the same. The report was orange and white from the Haneda incident. They reported orb. We have to give some license to pilots reporting from 1952. The mannerisms in which the interaction was occurring indicated what we call a tic-tac now. There was multiple UFOs. They didn't use the term raining UFOs in the 1950s, but that is something that they elaborated on. The phenomena was exhibiting action, was exhibiting a targeting capability, and was exhibiting some semblance of sentience, which really redefines what it is we might be looking at. Now, again, from strategic security perspective, my starting point is I don't know, and I'm not going to hypothesize about intent, because if I don't have enough to verify intent, I can always use a target-centric approach on signatures to determine capability. And then once I'm able to define capability, then I might be able to start looking at intent. And now it doesn't always have to be one or the other. Oftentimes they're concurrent. And sometimes we start with intent, and then we have to determine capability. But at this point, with what I've been looking at this dissertation, is using the 1950s case and the 2 cases, the Nimitz and the Theodore Roosevelt case, is we're able to possibly have a better assessment of capability over 70 years of time where this phenomena has been interacting with aircraft or even people or other objects and systems of systems that are out there.
Matt, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, so I have a couple pent-up points from the last couple of minutes. So one is on psychology and the human sensor. So even though my PhD is in physics, I've talked to colleagues, professors of psychology, and I was shocked to learn that there's no such thing as mass hallucination. It's made up. It's a myth. So I like the point about how, like, if you have 2 or more witnesses, that increases the probability, definitely. Because with one, if you don't have non-human sensor corroboration, it's very hard. But no one's answered my challenge yet in the scientific community to psychologists, psychiatrists, and neurologists. I'm like, can you show me a peer-reviewed scientific study that proves that 2 or more people can hallucinate the same thing at the same time? Because if you can, then you've proved telepathy, something else that doesn't exist allegedly. So I think that having multiple credible witnesses is wonderful. You could still have, of course, there's always cases of one person of a dominant personality. It's like, do you see that right now? But you can't transmit your hallucination to somebody else. The other aspect we talked about is the non-human sensor, of course, the sensor platforms, like we had on UAPX. We thought it was absolutely crazy that the congressional hearing made no mention of SCU, made no mention of UAPX. The Gillibrand Amendment original wording was scrubbed that had mentioned SCU and Galileo Project explicitly. They say they want openness and want to learn, but don't want to engage with the people who have already been doing this. Some of them, like Rich, have been doing this for decades, and they don't want to learn what intelligence we've already gathered, and I think that that's a disservice to the entire field.
Can I also inject one thing, if I may?
Please, go ahead.
So you're all sitting here in Huntsville, Alabama, in October 12th of 2012. There was an object that was seen taking off from this base, and it was heading north. And I had immediately phone calls from people saying around the city who knew that I was in it, calling, and I think three or four people, and said, "Are you seeing this object that's going up north?" And I'm saying, "No, I didn't." And so here I was going into a meeting, and I decided that I was going to go in, and I'm looking up in the sky, and it was a beautiful blue sky. There were puffy clouds going by and everything else. And I'm watching as this light would be on, and then it would be off. On and off. And it's just like that, right? Roughly in the same spot. And I'm going like, I'm thinking I'm seeing my first UFO, right? Wow, I'm finally seeing one, right? And I even saw some people that were coming by and said, "Look up there, do you see that too?" And they were saying, "What?" And it was a little dot up there. Next thing I know, what happened is I got to work, and then somebody said, "Did you see that long cylinder that was up in the sky today?" I'm going like, "No, I didn't." "What was it? You saw a cylinder that was up there?" "Really?" And then the next day, because I was in MUFON, and I had the ability to go and look at the database. Over the next 4 days, this long thing moved all the way up to Canada. Along the way, there were like 40 reports of UFOs that were going on up, and all the descriptions varied. It was a dot, it was an orb, it was a long thing, it was like this. But you could also look at the wind pattern that was going across the United States at the time, and it took it right up that way. One gentleman in Kentucky had a telescope, and he had it brought up, and sure enough, he took a good close-up picture of it, and it was a long cylinder with some little things on it. It was a Google Loon secret project that Google had to be able to bring internet to these different places, right? Okay, and they didn't tell you that for like another year. Okay, so turned out it was launched from here. It was using a NASA balloon that was launched, and it had all these things, and they were doing this test. I guess what I'm trying to get at here is, going back to what I said about people's descriptions vary, and the human challenge that we have, that we get that information, and why it is that, you're not hearing about those cases going back in the past that we're looking at, and you're hearing about the Nimitz going forward. It's because, guess what? You got the technology there now you're using to be able to get things that are better, that will help these people and help all of us get a better understanding of these objects. When we did the Aguadilla kind of case or something like that, it was the first time we had a chance to see something in infrared. It's like there's not a whole lot of those. And military-grade equipment, by the way. So it's like we paid millions of dollars for these things, and now we're getting, wow, this is incredible. So I just want to point out to you, as technology continues to morph on, we'll get better and better information. Of course, an example of good, what they're getting in UAPX with all the equipment, that'll be fabulous. But I just want to share with you that human challenge and how the interpretation can vary of that same object that was moving up through the skies from here.
It's a great point, Rich. I think one of the key takeaways I'd offer is the importance of, and I'm going to say the word collection, even though this is a civilian organization, it's critical to use technical means to gather your data in the field, but as equally as important is an intelligence-driven approach. You've got to understand, in my opinion, respectfully, I think it's critical that as we collect data technically, the way it's analyzed is driven by doctrinal analytic tradecraft, if you will. And there's a lot of open source data. Josh mentioned the target-centric approach. There's a great book on it. I think it's Dr. Clark, Richard
Dr. Clark.
It's great methodology for analyzing data when collected via technical means. So I would encourage, for those in the audience, whether they're physically present or virtual, to consider that, is that, yes, we've got to do this scientifically. It's got to be done using technical methods. But the analysis of the data really should be driven from a process that's doctrinally codified and consistent with best intelligence community practices. And that's just my own perspective in my role as National Security Advisor for the SCU. So that's just some thoughts that I'd like to share with everybody. But I think it's a great opportunity. Rich mentioned the Aguadilla report. I encourage everybody to, if they haven't read it yet, please get on the SCU website, take a look at it. Josh, we're all excited for your dissertation to get published. No pressure, but we're all excited to see your work and get a feel for the different observations beyond the established 5 that you found in your research. And before I close out this question, does anybody have any closing thoughts they want to share? No. Okay, great. I had to ask. I know everybody cringed when I did, but moving on to the next question, and this one's for Rich Hoffman. To start.
Yeah, to start.
How could these advancements in our efforts to understand UAP impact new research and development in the areas of spectrum analysis, spectrum warfare, secure communications, or cyber-related technologies?
Wow. Let me sum it up in 2 words. No, I wish I could. So I guess how I want to address that one is, number one, I'm kind of like this odd bird in the sense that I'm a ufologist within the military world, right? So that's kind of like a, almost like an oxymoron, isn't it, or something like that? But anyway, so the situation is that, the challenge is that I've gained a better understanding of the need for national security as I've now gotten into that field. And so I always walk the simple dance of like transparency versus, the security concerns of keeping things. And how do you deal with the fact that there's a whole world out there of people who experience these things that also want to know about what you're learning, right? And then how far can I go with knowledge sharing? And when do you trip over that and you're now into some sort of security concern and everything else? Because, it's always a delicate balance between the two. And to me, it's always been one of these things where it's like, literally over here at the Arsenal, probably every minute there's at least 200 attempts to attack our IT systems by every country that's out there that wants to be a nasty adversary, right? And all these hackers. And we're constantly dealing with those security threats to get our information. Why? Because they want to be able to get things like R&D that they don't have to spend money on, and they can get that R&D, right? So, I jokingly pointed out to the number of years there was a gentleman in the UK called Garry Nolan. He ended up getting some information in a NASA system, and he saw everything else. I said, I welcome him to come to my desktop at work, because if he took a look at the UFO stuff that I had, he'd have a fun time looking at that, Wow, the Army is actually really into this stuff if they came into my computer, right? So I'm going like, boy, that's pretty interesting. But anyway, to me, it's a situation, just getting hacked. But we're always out looking at that cybersecurity concern. We're looking at the national security implications of this phenomena, if you would. It's not. I understand that the United States government wants to do what it can around this thing, but I really strongly encourage that there needs to be some sort of sharing amongst our other people that are friendly and everything else, that we can have conferences like this and everything else, because I really believe that collaboration is going to help, and getting scientists around the world engaged is also going to be able to help us out. So I think that that's an important point that I just wanted to make. And then we have to figure out, well, how do we not get into sources and methods and all that wonderful stuff that's in the classified world? And I've also struggled with the fact that there's a lot of information out there that literally I see on the CyberNet and things like that could be shared. If you redact certain pieces of information and everything else, you can do that. And so my hope is that ultimately we can do that delicate balance, but figure out how we can be more transparent and open about things. And I don't know, does that answer the question at
So
all?
I would say, yeah, no, it was great.
But I was going to say
response.
also spectrum, because you did bring up the spectrum.
That
Let me
was
come
where
back-
I was
So
going.
spectrum in the context, and I think that, if you talk to Travis Taylor in this room, you'd see that he was trying to look at implications and stuff like that from across the spectrum out at the Skinwalker Ranch, right? It was like, going across the electromagnetic spectrum. And, our combat systems and things we have for our defense rely on those kinds of things and that they don't interfere, right? I mean, we're communicating with a pilot, between a pilot and a ship and everything else, and all those communications things rely on that radio frequency that they've got, and you can't have that overlapping concern from other things that are interfering with it. Well, if UAP are having an impact, and that's why you would like, well, what frequency was it? And I need to find out, went out and work it out. That's why you have all these people to be able to work through those things, to be able to do that. And I think that, the spectrum is a great part of our discovery about this phenomena, and we need to look at multi parts of the spectrum. And I'm thrilled by the fact that if you have infrared, you're out of the visible part of that spectrum, right? And the spectrum is huge. I mean, in either end, So why don't we start looking at these things from those other advantage points? And I think that we need to look at that as well.
I think, Rich, your comments are spot on. I think, if I may, understanding the ability to properly measure and document specific signatures using whatever means available to the civilian side of the house, I think is a great strategy to collect data. I can see Dr. Szydagis, knowing him as well as I do, has something he wants to add to that. So go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, so on the issue specifically of signature management, actually, that's one of the observables, if I'm not mistaken. That's exactly why you need multimodal sensors, because it is, even if you had a civilization potentially or technology far more advanced than us, it would probably be impossible, almost impossible, or really hard to mask all your signature in all the different possible ways. So in fact, there's historical evidence of this. This goes back to the 1990s with cases in Mexico where you had objects that were visible in infrared, invisible to the naked eye, and vice versa, that don't make any sense. You have your lenses invisible and infrared pointed at the same proportion of the sky, and one sees nothing and one sees a very clear object. So I think that this issue of signature management, there's been, Lou Alzano's talked about this, is a really important one, and how you get around that is by having multimodal sensors, which was called for by the UAP task force. We did this on UAPX, as we're talking about tomorrow. We're partnering with SCU to analyze the data we have. And again, no mention in the congressional hearing, even though we did exactly what the UAP task force called for last year. We went and did it, but no recognition and credit for that whatsoever on the Hill. And the whole approach is you don't just it's not just different frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum. You have to go beyond that as well. And we see this in all fields of science, and especially in astronomy. You learn more the more new vistas you open up. Suddenly you realize, oh, you weren't listening to that part of the universe, and you don't even know what's there. In the history of astronomy, this happened with development of telescopes that didn't just do visible light. Right? We have radio telescopes. We have the cosmic microwave background studied a different way. We have telescopes across the electromagnetic spectrum, but the electromagnetic spectrum is not everything there is. We then developed gravitational waves with LIGO and Virgo, and suddenly now we're looking at a completely different part of the universe. Maybe a few centuries we'll talk about how, how we used to look using light at the universe, and now we use gravity because it's so much better. These are the things we need to consider is really outside the box thinking on the type of sensors we want to use.
That's great, Matt. Thank you. I hope it's evident to the audience that what we're trying to do here is tease out some thoughts, and the theme so far, at least in my mind, is for those of you out in the field that are really studying this or investigating it, technical collection or technical analysis is critical. Data sharing and collaboration is critical. an intelligence-driven analytic methodology is critical. A multimodality sensor strategy is critical. Use infrared, but use thermal as well. Understand the different spectrums that you're dealing with. Electromagnetic frequency detection is important, but it can't be just one or the other. It's got to be an all-the-above approach. And in order to understand the phenomenon truly from a technical perspective, that's the only way to do it, because invariably what one individual may see in one region of the world using technical means may not be the same capability others are seeing in other parts of the world. And it's not all the same. And again, it's important to use technical methods, but a multimodality approach. Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to point out to you that, like, for example, those devices that we're putting on the installations for looking for drones, allegedly. What happens if one's not a drone? Okay, you know, you get the idea, right? But anyway, we're using acoustics, we're using spectrum, and we're using everything from, like, sonic. You know, we're also looking for radar. We got all those devices there to be able to, and that's the kind of approach that I'm talking about, where you're starting to get all those different other sensors, if you would, that feeds you information to allow the individual then to go take control of that individual's drone, and we can drop it. We can find out where the operator is off base, and we have the means of doing that as well, right? If it's a drone, what happens if it's not a drone? You know, if it's a UAP, will these things work? And I can give you an example in just the USS Kearsarge, in a sense where they had two systems that were allegedly supposed to be able to go and to do that drone killing. They didn't work. Okay? So what does that tell you? If it wasn't a drone and we couldn't take over, what was it? How are we going to distinguish that? From a national security standpoint, if I'm on the ship, are these hostiles or not hostiles? And I can't discern whether it's a drone or I can't determine whether it's a UAP, right? So you come back to, why are we talking about national and threat management?
Right. I think, Rich, I think a key point was, you know, along with all the other types of sensors, acoustic is an important part of it as well. Dr. Nolan, any comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
he touched on one of the things that I find interesting is what are we not listening to that's there?
Yes.
And the other one is there a signal already being sent to us? Right, so there's signal that you hear about, right? People hear things in their head. How are they doing that?
Right.
Right? What is that? You know, how are they reaching into people's brains, affecting the proteins in ways that we can't possibly understand, that get turned into a signal in our head? So somehow the information comes from over there where we don't understand it to over here where at least we can turn it into an electrical signal understanding and say, okay, well, but then how does that turn into consciousness? And how do such complex concepts get passed over? So that's a kind of signal. And then I think of these objects individually and how they coordinate. So how are they coordinating with each other? Right? Do they just know ahead of time what they're going to do? Or is there some very low-level EM going between them, or something behind the scenes down under into some other quantum level that they're interacting with each other? So to me, that is not just a question, it's a practicality opportunity. Right. If they're doing it, how are they doing it, and how can we replicate it? I mean, that's what gets me excited, because I'm interested, I mean, again, going back to my cancer work, I look at stuff, I figure something out, and I go, oh, wow, okay, we can use this, I can make this instrument, and I can give everybody else the possibility to do this. So that's yet another, I think, thing that I think we're being given a signal somehow. There's clearly something emanating that is not passive that we need to understand. They affect our planes, right? I mean, they reach in, turn stuff off. They reach in and read stuff from people's heads. What is that?
So the ability, if it's emanating there at some point, or to some degree, there's an opportunity to intercept that emanation, exploit it, and understand it. So again, I think for the purposes of the audience, it's just important to emphasize a multimodal collection strategy in whatever the organization is, and use those well-established, well-defined analytic methodologies to really dig into your data and understand what it is you've actually collected, and how to make that information meaningful to the end user. So I want to thank everybody for their comments. The next question is for Dr. Nolan. What new technologies could be developed to better understand the uniqueness of potential material designs that would be aligned to production methodologies involved in the development of craft with performance characteristics that mimic UAP capabilities?
So, again, I'm sorry that I keep going back to my standard academic work, but we try to understand the body by breaking down pieces into organs, cells, proteins, RNA, atoms. At the end of the day, what the real answer is to understand form and function is where the atoms are positioned in these objects that we're interested in and how they interact with each other. And so let's say that one of us were given a piece of technology that, bar no hoax, is clearly from one of these objects. How are we going to understand it? And so, we have, many of the people in this room are well-versed in the kinds of technologies that can be used, everything from mass spec, X-ray crystallography, blah, blah, blah. But we do not yet have a technology that lets us look down to the atomic level, right, and see exactly where things are. Because at one point, we're going to need to engage the scientific community with, we'll have the ability someday to do that, right? And so then we hand this to other scientists and we say, okay, we have no idea what the function of the object was that this came from, but can you tell me why somebody would put this atom next to that atom, next to that atom, next to that atom? Because as we know in all science, you can have all of these different functions of things, and then emergent properties arise out of the interaction of multiple systems. So, this is where we're at. We haven't even collected the parts list yet of what it is that we're dealing with. So for instance, if I were given a bunch of parts of the stealth B-52 bomber, right? One from the leading edge of the plane, one from the this, one from the that. One part is involved in stealth, the other is involved in lift, the other is just basically somebody scrawled their name on the thing, right? So, and then how do I put all those pieces together, and how do I know what they are? We need a forensics approach from the bottom up, and to collect and create an ontology, basically a list of parts and things. And then that I think points us in a direction of exploitation and making things. And practicality is one thing, but this is a discussion about national security. If we don't do this now, you can be sure the Chinese are doing it last week, right? And I'm telling you, if you've got something that's doing what we're seeing, you're looking at thousands of technology revolutions ahead of us. You get any one of those working for everything from gravity, et cetera, communications, we're in big trouble.
I think that's a great point. I know a lot of people have interacted with some discord over using the phraseology of national security in relation to the scientific study of UAP, but the reality is there are objects that are performing with characteristics that are not in the U.S. inventory, at least that anyone's willing to admit to. The general consensus is that these entities, these vehicles, are not in the Russian or Chinese inventory either. Again, I'm not speaking on behalf of any government authority. I'm just simply reiterating what seems to be the general consensus within the public domain. But they're out there. That's the bottom line. They're out there. They're outmaneuvering our aircraft, as Ryan so graciously characterized yesterday. They're performing in a way that we can't keep up with. And the simple fact of the matter is that if it's not us, and we don't think it's Russia or China, to your point, that Russia or China is obviously going to be striving for those capabilities simply because we can't match them right now.
You can be sure that they're watching right now.
Right.
You know, and Kevin Newth did an amazing, was involved in an amazing paper published, right, on if an object about a ton moves from the level of the sea to, you know, space in less than a second, entire energy output of the United States in a day. And they do these things at will. What does that imply?
Right.
Well, it implies, if anybody understood it, it's a bomb of, it could probably blow up this area of the galactic arm if we misused it. But, you know, I think there's, you know, if we don't get scared about it, it's like, how do we entice policymakers with the opportunity, right? Not just to protect ourselves, but to also exploit and move ourselves forward.
That's a great point. And I think understanding the design, the production methodology, even if it's just a simple piece of chaff or material, the ability to model that positionally at the atomic level, while that capability does not exist, that's very likely the level of depth we'll need to go to as a scientific community to understand what we typically categorize as metamaterial, why it operates that way or why it functions that way, and how it was produced. Rich?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, right here at the Arsenal, there's an organization called the MISIC, which is the Missile Space Intelligence Center. And, you know, going back to your point about, you know, you get an aircraft and you can figure out where you take those parts and pieces. Well, you know, and when I was growing up in Dayton, Ohio, they had Foreign Technology Division. These are the places where they would send the missiles from other countries or whatever like that. They would send them to these locations, and then these engineers get together and figure out, what does this do? What does that do? You know, and they're tearing it apart to figure out, how does it operate? How does it move? How does it do what it does? What is the purpose of this? And so, but they didn't get down to the level of granularity of like single atoms and things like that, you know, that, like you're talking about. You know, they were, and then plus they knew that how it was used, because it landed and it was shot off of a rocket. So they had a little bit more of an awareness for that. When you're dealing with something novel, I mean, you know, it's like you've never seen this before. You know, these kind of mixtures of these things, these elements and things like that coming together in a way you've never seen it. That's a whole other equation. And then you're trying to interpret, well, where does this, is this the stick that they use to be able to do that or that? And it's just, it's a very big challenge. I just want to underscore that and put that in the context.
Appreciate it, Rich. Gents, any other questions or comments?
Yes, so I have several. I want to say I'm very skeptical on the whole reverse engineering thing from two aspects. One is for allegedly advanced civilizations, they seem to crash a lot. So that's really striking as extremely odd. And that tells me if it is real, then maybe we're dealing with a defunct, the detritus of a defunct civilization, like Avi Loeb suggests. Like it could be things that were built to last for millions of years, but then their time came up and machines break down. I think that's one possibility. It would still be way better, of course, than what we have. You know, computer breaks every few years, got to get a new one. But the other thing is I'm skeptical even if we had parts, obviously they denied it in the hearing, you know, what were they going to, of course they were going to deny it even if we had something. I'm skeptical of our ability to make any progress whatsoever. I think it would be like handing your laptop to Michael Faraday in the 1890s. How much progress do you think he would make? One of the greatest minds of the 19th century. He would make none whatsoever. By the time the battery died also, he'd make even less progress on your laptop. And I don't subscribe to the like mice versus humans. I think that analogy is too extreme. I think a better analogy is if we actually had parts of alleged parts of an alleged advanced civilization. I think the better analogy in my mind would be like we're like the brightest minds of the 19th century. I think the only way to fix that is you need to have something like the Manhattan Project, except even 10 times bigger. You need thousands of scientists and you working on it in the hope of making the faintest progress whatsoever. But I did have a question for Garry. I was confused by one thing. I've looked at individual atoms in grad school, so I'm not sure what you mean by we don't have the technology. We have the atomic force microscope and the scanning electron.
But that doesn't tell you the structure of glass. It doesn't tell you where the molecules or the atoms are.
You mean like individual ones in 3 dimensions?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, I'm thinking of the global properties.
Yeah.
You can see like a sea of atoms, but
right.
not, yeah.
But if you could, for instance, with sub-angstrom resolution, determine the position of an atom, you can tell whether it's in a single or a double bond. And then you got, I mean, just think of the things that we know that are complicated in some of the superconductors with perovskites and things. You move a rubidium from here to there, and it's not a superconductor anymore.
Still don't understand how superconductors work.
Exactly.
Still don't understand.
Well, I mean, and that's why I think, I agree with you that we're never going to rebuild one of these craft.
Yeah.
But even if I figure out, so there are claims that, that fiber optics came from this stuff, right? Yes or no doesn't matter. It probably wasn't being used for what we're using it today. So even if I learn something new about how to use something from an atomic organization that I understand a new principle, that's an advance. I said thousands of advances. So maybe we make a half step with picking up the pieces. So that's what I'm excited about. I never expect that we're going to be rebuilding stuff and jetting around like the Jetsons.
Yeah.
Well, I think the important point, and I agree, Gary, I think the important point is through the scientific study in this area, we can create innovation. We can create new technologies, new capabilities, new approaches to understanding the unknown. And again, I think it takes a little bit of outside-the-box thinking, a lot of initiative, some personal courage, and a lot of collaboration. So I want to thank you all for your comments on this question. We're going to move to the last question and then take questions from the audience. The last question is for Dr. Szydagis. Matt, what new sensor or signature detection capabilities could be developed to detect a visible or not visible UAP presence?
So we don't even need new ones yet. We need to start applying more often the things that we already have in hand. Because what we have commercially available is already something that a time traveler from the DoD from the 1980s would have been blown away by. Just your iPhone would have been a military secret if it fell into the Pentagon in 1982 or something. So what we need to do is just put to use first what we already have, and then we're going to learn what we need to improve it by looking at, so the complaint you always get, you have fuzzy, why do we still have fuzzy images of UFO? That means not real. How do you expect to have a non-fuzzy image of something that's allegedly going Mach 60? It's just, these are idiotic criticisms from people who don't understand that this is a tough problem. So what we need to do, we need to start, though, with the tools we have and build from there. So yeah, our approach on UAPX was to not start from scratch, which seems to be a lot of approaches, but rather take some of the lessons from history and historical cases and say, what sensor would I have wanted to have if I was, if I was in the car for the Cash Landrum case, or if I was Betty or Barney Hill, what modern piece of technology would I want? And use that as a question to motivate what can we do moving forward.
Matt, I think that's outstanding. Again, everybody, I want to express one more time, the questions that were selected for this panel were very intentional. What we're trying to do is generate thought leadership here. There's a lot of technology that's currently out there that if we use it in synchronization with each other, a lot of capabilities that if we fuse them together, integrate them, we create something that really hadn't previously existed in its own individual form prior to. More importantly, it's when you're able to do that using a multimodality approach, it's critical that you analyze the data in a manner that's consistent with the way the intelligence community does, and that's not a big secret. There are many different open sources to understand how the government analyzes data, and that is very powerful when put in the hands of somebody who's taken an approach, a data collection approach, technically, that's consistent with what Matt's characterizing. Any questions or comments from the panel? No. Okay. I've got a couple of questions from the audience, so I'm just going to start with some from the virtual community. The first question is, if UAP studies are only supported in the context of security concerns, we could ultimately lose if it's determined that UAPs pose no threat and the field is pushed back into the background again. I agree. We need to create the momentum for a scientific exploration becoming the major focus. Okay. How do we encourage that shift? I think exactly what we're doing right now is how we encourage that shift. Focus on the technical collection process. Look at it by not attempting to gather the data using just one means of collection, one technology, one capability, but take an all-the-above approach. Look at infrared, thermal, acoustic, what's in the electromagnetic spectrum, understanding the frequency analysis part of studying UAP. I think it's an all-the-above approach, and I think when you're able to do that, you're able to provide enough data to generate serious discussion by policymakers. Gary?
You know, I'm an optimist, so I look at the data and see so the way around the problem of it just being a national security is to say there's opportunity.
Absolutely.
Right? And in the sciences, at least in biology, it was basic mechanism, basic science, which is just information for information's sake. Put it in the library. And then it started to become translational. And then translational was opportunity. And so that's how medicine and biology became biomedical research. Because there's this bench to bedside opportunity here. And so that's how I think we engage the public and calm the fears, hopefully. I mean, look, anything that is found is going to be used for defense at some level, and should be, I think.
Yeah. Defense of the nation, that's understandable. Rich?
I think a lot's also going to come from the work that this gentleman's going to do, right? He's out there defining all of the massent, the measures, signals, intelligence, and how we can collect it, right? I mean, ultimately, you're going to help to shape the conversation about where we ought to go and what kind of tools we need to be able to tackle that, and I'm excited about it.
There's also a key point with that is Dr. Wendt brought up a great point in his presentation about the ontological threat, right? So we have to understand that DoD is designed to fight and win wars. Ryan brought that up yesterday, and I think that's something that we need to reaffirm, is that anything in DoD is going to be geared toward assessing whether or not, and when I say adversary, it could be our traditional adversaries and our non-traditional adversaries, or something we just don't know, is going to be, we are assessing that through a threat matrix to determine what it can do to end the social contract of the United States. And that's important to understand, that as we're trying to talk about how do we get information from the government, why is it parked in DoD, how do we, is it something that we can do on our own? And I think given what UAPX accomplished, this is definitely something that the community now has the capability to start assessing on their own, and then running it through an a structured analytic technique used for intelligence analysis, which is a scientific process, which differs from a scientific method. I don't need to start with a hypothesis when I'm doing my research. I can start with a question and a curation standard, because that is what Intel is I seek to answer a priority information requirement or question, and then I have a curation standard for what I'm running my data through based off of that question. And then the output is a series of other techniques that are used to provide a predictive model. And so if we understand that when we say threat, we don't mean that, somebody could, park a bomb outside the, facility, whatever. It could be ontological. They could be friendly, and we just don't know it. But it still poses, there is still that gap of what is threat. And so as a scientific community is looking at it from a scientific proposition, there's also the value proposition on the strategic security element and the national security element, that we have to look out for the interests of those of us sitting in this room, for the security interests of those of us in this room.
Thank you, Josh.
I think we've had one thing that's been confusing about the government approaches, if you look the past few decades, but also now, even between different agencies, it's a very schizoid approach. It's like Schrodinger's cat. We've been told it's not a national security threat, don't worry about it. And now, yes, it is a national security threat. So make up your mind.
Alive or
Is
dead?
it or is it not a national security threat? And I feel like UAPs have had it both ways. And we saw that in the congressional hearing even. Oh, it's not a big deal. Let's smile, about it. And at the same time, it's a national security threat. So which is it? Right. So but I think, unfortunately, to back to the original question, that that fear of your security, physical or ontological, is unfortunately a good motivator, and that's human nature. But I do think that we should not rely on that. I think we should be more positive, as Gary said, optimistic. But I do think that, unfortunately, security fears are motivator. But I wanted to also, it still bothers me, we still talk about national security or U.S. security. If it is true we're talking about a non-human intelligence, that's irrelevant. It's global security. There's a worldwide phenomenon. So do you think that if advanced civilizations exist, they care about our 200 warring tribes that we have in this country with different colors on the map? They don't care about U.S. versus Russia and China. All of that is irrelevant. If the ET or similar hypothesis is true, U.S. security is irrelevant. National security irrelevant. It's a global problem for all of humanity. So one thing I would like to see is, I'm still also very realistic and also a patriot and recognize U.S. is still despite its flaws, is still one of the best countries on this planet. And we still have, I'm old-fashioned, we still have good guys and bad guys. We see this every day. We look at Russia and Ukraine. Unfortunately, we can't work with everybody. But we should at least get the ball rolling working with friendly countries and work with our allies in this. Stop treating this as a national security issue. If it is a security issue, it's not a national one. Delete the word national. It's global. It's not national. It's only national security if it's Russian or Chinese or foreign actor. But if it's a non-human intelligence, it's not national security, it's global. So start working with UK, NATO, our allies, at least with friendly countries, work together at least with them, even if we can't get the entire world on board, because frankly, I know it's an oversimplification. We still have good guys and bad guys, unfortunately, in the 21st century. But we start working with friendly nations together to try to solve this global problem. It's not just over the US or US waters. It's all over the world people see UFOs and UAP.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. Next question is for Dr. Nolan. Which scientific discipline could possibly contribute to this field of study is most absent from the overall discussion on UAP?
Wow.
I'm glad you got that one.
Saved you a good one, buddy.
Take it.
Well, I think physics, quantum physics, that there's something behind the scenes yet that we don't appreciate, that they're exploiting. And so, energy extraction, how are they doing it at the same time while not burning their ships to a cinder, right? So that to me is the thing that, but it shouldn't just be theoretical. There's also, it's kind of the materials testing thing. I mean, some of the stuff that Ryan's doing, for instance, with the AI materials analysis approach, that's an information science, laboratory that you can set up in a computer. So there's really needs to be a lot more emphasis on that, and then marrying that to the actual physics of how the universe operates. But I think as well, and I listen sometimes to Eric and others, other physicists arguing with each other about what is the right way to interpret how the universe operates. There's probably 100 different ways to interpret it, and they're all wrong, but they should all be used as potential solutions. Right. It's the same thing that we say about the UAP. If you take the UAP answer off the table, you might have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. So I think there's still a lot of opportunity there that needs to be, to me, that's the one least I'm most interested in, perhaps because I don't understand it as much or as well as I should. But I think it's still something that really isn't talked about enough yet.
Well, there's the resident physicist on the panel. As you said, we should also separate the possibility of physics versus engineering. Even though it's a low probability, I would say, I'm still open to the possibility that if there are advanced civilizations, actually, they're not using any new physics we don't understand already. It's a question of engineering. We may have already some of the knowledge we need from general relativity and quantum mechanics, but we don't have the engineering. So here's an example of that. We had for centuries the correct equations to use to figure out air travel. So why didn't we do it? we have Isaac Newton, we have Bernoulli, because it's not that simple. So sometimes it's a question of engineering. Sometimes it's a question of both. We absolutely don't know everything. We don't know how to marry relativity and quantum mechanics. We may discover that we need more paradigm shifts in physics, but I'm wondering do we first need some paradigm shifts in engineering? We don't have, for example, we have not applied general relativity to propulsion. We're still, centuries after Isaac Newton, our only way of getting to outer space is throwing things out the back and conserving moment. That's all we know how to do. Why don't we, engineer the space-time metric, things we've known for 100 years? Because maybe we know the physics, but maybe we don't know the engineering. And if we don't know either the physics or the engineering, that's even worse. But like a homework problem I give my students, for example, I always point out that you can get to the Andromeda Galaxy in one human lifetime. You don't need any new physics for that. You don't need any wormholes. You don't need faster light travel. You just capitalize on relativistic time dilation. Problem is we don't have the fuel. So we have the engineering to do that. So we have to divorce their two levels of impossible or difficult, which is paradigm shifts in physics and paradigm shifts in engineering to apply the physics. And engineers, like my colleague, Professor Kevin Knuth always says, they're very good at finding loopholes. Taking the known laws of physics, chemistry, biology, and finding loopholes to make a technology works that looks like it's breaking the known laws of physics, but actually it's not. It's just that we were misinterpreting things we've already known. So there's a combination of both things, unknown physics and unknown engineering, potentially, when we're talking about advanced technology.
Well, I'm ready for a bourbon. That was great. No, I appreciate it, Matt. That's great. Great characterization and outstanding perspective, as always. So we're running a little bit low on time, so I'm going to speed through a few of these, if that's okay, Rich?
Sure.
Okay. I may pose them to one member of the panel, so if I ask a specific panel member, let's just limit it to that individual, and then we'll move on to the next one, just to try to give all the questions an opportunity to be heard. Should Congress appropriate funds for the scientific study of UAP by academia as a way to study outside of the national security arena? I think that's a no-brainer. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no reason in my mind why we couldn't use public data in the public domain, unclassified information, and provide that to universities and organizations like the SCU and UAPX. Garry, just tipping my hat to you. But I think that's an imperative. I hope at some point this is a conversation with the National Science Foundation, and we're able to have a thoughtful discussion about maybe just topic studies that could be funded without necessarily data being provided by the government, but just topic areas for general research. So whoever posed that question, it's a great one. I totally agree. Question for me, what areas have the most UAP sightings been? I've got to be honest, I think I would be stretching if I attempted to answer that. I'm going to look to Rich Hoffman for that.
Good luck, buddy.
Are you Rich Hoffman? Would you repeat the question, please?
What areas, I think they're speaking geographically, maybe a continent. What areas have had the most UAP sightings?
Oh, my God.
North America, South America?
Well,
It's an easy one, Rich.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to say. Robert Powell did a great job of taking and plotting UFO sightings over a period of length of time, and you couldn't even see the U.S. map anymore because it was everywhere, right? I mean, and if you took out the ones that you could come up logically with, then you might be able to say, well, they're highly populated areas, right? And then you say, okay, do farmers report the objects and stuff like that? Well, many of them don't have internet, don't have any way of getting there, not familiar with MUFON or anybody else to report it. I would say that basically, pretty much the vast part of the human population have seen something. The big problem is that nobody reports. So consequently, you get a situation where, like, it used to be in the days of Hynek and Valet, they were going around giving and saying 1 out of every 12 sightings were being reported. It's way higher than that. So you really don't know statistically where it is on the globe.
So I appreciate that,
So,
Rich.
yeah.
We got a question from the illustrious Dr. Davis.
Make a comment to Rich. Rich, at NIDS, we gathered enough data such that we put a big giant wall map of the United States on a wall. And we realized from our data that all we had to do is throw a dart at the map. Wherever that dart
Yeah,
landed, we
right.
would go there, investigate, we'll find a massive
You will.
UFO story that nobody talks
Right.
about.
Let me tell you, I had a family that came up and they saw me on a television show in Dayton, Ohio, and they said, we had a sighting 48 years ago. We haven't told anybody. You're the first person we've told it to. Now, the interesting thing about that was that where they told me they all lived around a lake or a pond, right? And they had seen an encounter in their back window with the lights. There was something over the pond. They didn't know what it was, right? They said the next day, the neighbor kid came over and was saying, hey, did you see the orange light hanging above the pond? No, we didn't see it. Really? Tell us about it. And so the little kid would say, yeah, we all watched the thing over the pond. We didn't know what it was. It was just hovering above the water and stuff like that. Well, okay, now there's 2 houses. There's 3 houses around the pond, right? What about the third person? I did a tracking down to find out, well, the husband had died, and the wife was there, and she proceeded to tell me her story about being around the pond. Did any of them report it? No. So that's
Help me out.
the challenge.
One of the things I find fascinating about the numbers of reports is it's a pretty busy planet.
Right.
There's a lot of
It
stuff
is.
going on. And that really, it either scares me or excites me. I don't know which, a little of both. But there's a lot going on. And what does that mean? I mean, people should just, I always say, when people say, oh, well, do you believe in UFOs? No, I don't believe in UFOs. I believe in data.
Right.
That's the data.
Right.
You tell me what it means.
Right.
And that usually gets their wheels turning.
No, that's a great answer. I appreciate it. And just as an alibi, I have a feeling one of my kids submitted that question, so I'm getting the high sign from my wife. So Dad says thanks. Next question. Has anyone considered or are they looking at cataloging hyperspectral imaging, MASINT, SIGINT, ELINT, GEOINT, and data mining the aggregated intelligence? I have no idea. I mean, that's a question that only someone in the government could answer, and that's not any of us. And candidly, it would not be appropriate to answer that question. Even if we knew it, simply because that would truly put national security at risk. So, however, I think that's a great question to present to your members of Congress.
Yeah.
Because if that's not happening, there's a congressional obligation to make sure that that's being done properly and classified at the appropriate level, not overclassified. So, great question, whoever asked it. Thank you. Have you found any potential UAP medical signatures that will be important to study and may further help us understand the technologies being employed? The SCU does, to my knowledge, have that information. So I don't know how to answer that. So I think that's a question that I encourage everybody to provide their members of Congress. Rich?
No.
Okay.
Just on a technical note, it's break time. We're going to have to start.
If you want to break, we'll break.
Yeah, we got a presenter that
Okay.
we're going to have to be
Let's
bringing
do it.
on. I'm
So,
just going to share that.
Everyone, just one final note. I don't know where they are. I saw them floating around in the back. I just want to thank Mr. George Knapp and Mr. Jeremy Corbell. They're in the building somewhere. Gentlemen, we're honored to have you. Thank you for visiting Rocket City and showing up for the conference. I hope I didn't spoil the surprise. We're thrilled to have you gentlemen here. Thanks for visiting. And I want to thank all of you for your patience and your attention on this panel discussion. And I want to thank each one of these gentlemen. They're all dear friends and respected colleagues. Thank you all for being a part of this great discussion.